I have known Julian Ashworth, the Hawthorn Duke, since we were boys with skinned knees and no notion yet of titles or graves. And in all that time I had never seen him look at anything the way he looked at her that afternoon in the memorial room, caught between fury and wonder, as if he had walked in on a ghost mending another ghost's dress. That is not a figure of speech. He had, in a manner, done exactly that. I was not present in the room itself, you understand. I arrived at Witchwood an hour later, summoned by a footman who did not know what else to do with a master gone suddenly quiet and strange, and I pieced the scene together afterward from Julian's own halting account, given to me that night over brandy neither of us drank. But I have told this story so many times since, to those who ask how it is that the Hawthorn Duke came to marry again after everyone had given up hope of it, that I feel I was there. I feel the dust in that room. I feel his hand on the door before he pushed it open. He had not meant to go in at all. That was the strange part, the part he kept returning to as though it explained everything or nothing. He had walked past the memorial room 1,000 times in the 5 years since Alina's death, the door at the end of the west corridor, always shut, always his to open and never opened. And on that particular afternoon, for no reason he could name beyond an ache he'd carried since morning, his hand had gone to the latch of its own accord. The door was not locked. He was mildly surprised by that. He had never asked whether it was locked, had simply assumed the room sealed itself in his absence, the way grief does, the way a wound closes over even when the pain beneath it does not. He pushed the door and it opened without complaint, well-oiled, the hinges silent, and that silence should have told him something before anything else did. Sunlight came through the tall window in long gold bars, catching motes of dust that ought to have been thick as snow in a room shut up 5 years, and were not. The furniture was under its sheets, ghostly humps of chairs, and a writing desk he remembered Alina bent over for hours composing letters to her sister. And there, in the center of the room, on a dress form angled to catch the best of the afternoon light, stood his wife's wedding gown. He had not looked at that gown since the day he'd had it placed there, folded by hands he did not remember, in the black fog of the weeks after her death. He had certainly not expected to find it standing upright and whole, its ivory silk catching the light like something alive, its lace collar unbroidered with the small brown speckles of age he had steeled himself, without knowing it, to someday find. And kneeling before it, needle in hand, a coil of pale thread caught between her lips, was a young woman he did recognize, though it took him a full 3 seconds to place her, because the last time he had seen her clearly she had been perhaps 12 years old, sitting on the low wall outside the village church with his Alina, both of them laughing at some joke long since lost to time. "Who let you in here?" His voice, when it finally arrived, did not sound like a question. It sounded, he told me later, like a stranger's voice, hoarse and low, and entirely too loud for that particular silence. She startled, of course she startled, any person would, discovered somewhere they had no evident right to be, by the very man who owned every stone of the place. But what struck him, what he could not stop describing to me later, was that she did not drop the needle. She did not fumble or flush and stammer excuses. She rose, slowly, smoothing her skirts with a composure that seemed to cost her something, and yet did not crack, and she looked him in the eye. "Your Grace," she said, "I did not hear you come in." "That is not an answer to my question." "No," she agreed, "it is not." He told me he almost laughed in the strange, giddy horror of the moment at her nerve. Almost. What stopped him was the gown itself, and the small wicker basket at her feet with its spools of thread sorted by shade, its packets of pins, its little pair of silver scissors worn smooth with use, and the sudden, dizzying comprehension that this was not the first time. That basket did not belong to a woman caught once, on impulse, in a room she should not have entered. It belonged to someone who came here as a matter of habit. "How long?" he said, and could not finish the sentence, because he did not know which ending frightened him more. "How long has this door stood unlocked? Or how long have you been coming here? Or how long has someone other than myself been the one keeping my wife's memory from rotting to dust?" She seemed to understand all 3 questions lived inside the one. 4 years, Your Grace, a little more." The number struck him like a physical blow. 4 years. Alina had been gone 5. This woman, and here he searched his memory properly for the first time, dragging up a name from some drawer he had not opened in a decade. This woman surely was Margaret Vane, the seamstress's daughter from the village, the girl who used to sit with Alina on the church wall. "Miss Vane," he said, and watching her face he saw the flicker of surprise that he remembered her name at all. quickly suppressed, quickly folded away the way she seemed to fold away every strong feeling that crossed her face, as if she had long practice at keeping her composure in rooms where she did not strictly belong. "Yes, Your Grace. You will explain yourself now. From the beginning." And so, in that dust-moted room with the last of the afternoon light sliding slowly across the floorboards, with his dead wife's gown standing between them like a silent witness, Margaret Vane told him the truth, plainly, without embellishment, in a voice that did not shake, though her hands, he noticed, were not quite steady at her sides. She told him that she and Eleanor had been girls together, before Eleanor became Lady Eleanor Hartwell, and before class and circumstance had drawn a line neither of them chose between the manor and the cottage. She told him of afternoons on that church wall, of a friendship that had not ended so much as changed shape, the way friendships must when one party marries a duke and the other marries a needle and thread, but had never, she said, and here her voice caught just slightly, the first crack in all that composure, never truly died. She told him that when Eleanor had fallen ill in the last 2 years, she had come to the kitchen door sometimes, quietly, and Mrs. Purnell, the housekeeper, had let her sit an hour with her old friend when the Duchess was strong enough for company, and the Duke was occupied with doctors and business and the 1,000 grim errands of a house preparing, without saying so aloud, for a death. He had not known that. He told me this later with a kind of stricken wonder, that his wife had had a friend in her final months whom he had never once seen, never once thanked, because he had been too consumed by his own helplessness to notice who came and went through the kitchen door. And she told him at last of what came after, that in the weeks following Eleanor's death, Mrs. Purnell, knowing of the friendship and knowing that the gown and the letters had been shut away without proper care, without cedar or lavender or the ordinary vigilance any fine silk requires against moth and damp, had asked her not as an employee, not for wages, simply as one woman who had loved Eleanor to another, whether she might come sometimes and see to it, quietly, so as not to trouble him. "I should have moth holes the size of shillings in that lace by now if no one had tended it," she said, and there was something almost fierce beneath the quiet of her voice, the first true heat he had heard from her. "I could not let that happen, not to her gown, not while I had 2 working hands and a needle." He did not answer for a long moment. I picture it now as he described it, the 2 of them standing in that gold light, the sheeted furniture around them like patient watchers, the gown gleaming faintly between them, restored, whole, cared for, in a way he himself, master of the house, husband of the woman who had worn it, had not managed in 5 years to be brave enough to attempt. "You did this for 4 years," he said finally, "without my knowledge. Without payment." "Yes, Your Grace." "Why?" And here he told me. She looked at him with something that was not quite pity and not quite challenge, but a plain, unflinching honesty that unsettled him more than any excuse could have. "Because she was my friend before she was your wife," Margaret Vane said. "And friendship does not end merely because the friend has died. It only changes what it asks of you." He had no answer for that. He stood in the doorway of his own house, a man of considerable consequence, a man other men deferred to and women had once, before his marriage, angled hopefully for, and he found himself entirely without words in front of a seamstress half his rank, because she had said, simply and without artifice, the truest thing anyone had said to him in 5 years of careful, well-meaning, useless condolence. I asked him that night, brandy untouched between us, whether he had been angry. "I was suspicious first," he admitted. "One does not discover a stranger, for she was near enough a stranger to me, alone in a locked room with one's late wife's most private belongings, and think first of gratitude. I thought of theft. I thought, God forgive me, that she might have designs of some kind, some scheme to ingratiate herself, though I could not for the life of me construct what such a scheme would want with lace and thread. And then—" He was quiet a long moment, turning the glass in his hand without drinking from it. "And then she told me the truth, Charles, in that plain, unadorned way of hers, and I understood that suspicion was the coward's answer. The truth was worse. The truth was that a woman I barely knew had loved my wife more faithfully in her death than I had managed to love her. I could not go into that room. Do you understand? I could not open that door. I told myself it was grief, and it was, but it was also cowardice. And she—" his voice caught, the only time that night I heard it catch. "She went in every fortnight with her needle and her thread, and did the thing I was too much of a coward to do myself." I did not tell him then that I thought this the beginning of something larger than either of them yet understood. I only refilled his glass and let him sit with it, because some griefs need silence more than comfort, and I had learned this from watching him for 5 long years. Word of what Julian called dryly the discovery did not spread through the household in the way one might expect. Mrs. Purnell, when questioned, offered no apology and precious little explanation beyond a steady, dignified account that matched Margaret's in every particular, and something in her manner. The housekeeper had served 3 generations of Hartwells, and was not a woman who trembled before a duke's displeasure, seemed to settle whatever doubt lingered in Julian's mind. "I did not think you would welcome it, your grace," she told him, when he asked why she had never informed him. "You could scarce bear to pass the corridor. I did not think you could bear to know a stranger tended what you yourself could not." It was, I think, the most honest thing anyone in that household had said to him in years, and it stung precisely because it was true. He did not dismiss Margaret Vane from her quiet task, though I know he considered it in that first raw hour, purely from the shock of discovery and the old aristocratic instinct that recoils from finding one's private grief handled by unfamiliar hands. But by the time I arrived that evening, summoned by a footman's anxious note, he had already moved past that instinct into something more complicated, something he could not yet name and would not name for weeks besides. What he did do, 3 days later, was ride into the village. He did not tell me beforehand. I learned of it only when he mentioned, with the studied carelessness of a man who wishes to seem indifferent about a thing he is not indifferent about at all, that he had called upon Miss Vane at her cottage to thank her properly. And I asked, and she was mending a christening gown for the vicar's grandchild when I arrived, and barely looked up from her work, and told me that thanks were unnecessary, and that if I had truly wished to repay 4 years of careful mending, I might simply allow her to continue it in peace, without an audience. I laughed at that, and he did not, though something in his face suggested he had wanted to. "She dismissed you," I said. "She did not dismiss me. She simply did not require my gratitude to justify what she had already decided was right to do." He said this slowly, as though turning the thought over to examine its underside. "I have not met many people, Charles, who did not want something from a duke's attention. She wanted nothing. She wanted only to be left to her needle." "And did you leave her to it?" He was quiet a moment. "I stayed longer than I intended. That, I confess, was the moment I first suspected that the Hawthorn Duke, a man who had, in 5 years of widowhood, rebuffed every careful introduction his mother's friends had engineered, every eligible young woman paraded past him at every ball he could not decline without causing offense, had found something in a village cottage that no drawing-room had managed to offer him. I will not pretend the courtship, if one can call it that in its earliest weeks, was anything but hesitant on both sides. Margaret Vane, I came to learn, was not a woman easily swept by a title, and had, if anything, a native wariness of the attentions of a great house, having watched her own mother mend gowns for ladies who forgot her name between fittings. She did not curtsy lower or speak softer because a duke stood in her doorway. She measured him, I think, by the same plain, honest standard she measured everyone, and for some weeks he did not entirely pass that measure, because he came to her cottage twice more on invented pretexts. A torn curtain in the blue drawing-room, a query about the proper storage of old lace, and she saw through both immediately. "Your Grace's curtains are in perfectly good repair," she told him the second time with a directness that would have scandalized his mother's friends, and that he found, he confessed to me, unaccountably delightful. "If you wish to visit, you need not invent an excuse. I am not so grand that I require flattery disguised as commerce." He had the grace to look abashed, he told me, and then, this was new, this was something I had not seen in him for 5 years, he had laughed. Actually laughed, a real sound, not the polite exhalation he used at dinner parties to acknowledge a jest he found tedious. "Then I shall simply say," he told her, "that I wish to see you again and had not the courage to say so plainly." "That," she said, "I can respect a great deal more." It was, I think, the first moment either of them permitted the truth of the thing to surface between them, though neither called it courtship yet, and would not for some while, because both carried griefs and cautions that made haste impossible. Julian had buried a wife he loved deeply, and had spent 5 years believing himself incapable of loving again, not from any theatrical vow of fidelity to a memory, but from a simpler, sadder conviction that the capacity itself had been buried with her. Margaret, for her part, had watched her own mother work herself thin serving a class that rarely saw her as more than useful hands, and harbored no illusion that a duke's interest, however sincerely offered, could not curdle into something less than respect once the novelty wore thin. And so they proceeded slowly. He returned to the memorial room. This, I think, was the truest measure of what was changing in him. Not once but several times over that autumn, and on 2 occasions he asked her to let him sit with her while she worked, saying little, only watching her hands move over the lace with a competence that seemed to him, he said, almost sacred. "I used to think," he told me one evening, "that entering that room was an act of grief. I have come to think it can also be an act of love that does not require grief at all." She taught me that, without ever meaning to teach me anything. He asked her once, in that room, whether it troubled her, mending another woman's wedding gown while he sat nearby, in circumstances that even he could see had grown quietly charged with something neither of them named. She considered the question with her usual care before answering. "It troubled me," she admitted, "when I thought I mended it only for Aline's sake and no other reason lived beside it. Now I do not know what to call the reason. But I do not think Aline would begrudge me for finding I have come to care for the man who mourns her, your grace, so long as I have not stopped caring for the mending of what she left behind." It was, of all the things she said to him in that long autumn, the one he repeated to me most often, in the months and years that followed, as though it had settled some private argument he had been having with his own conscience. I ought to say something here of Aline herself, since she moves through this story as a kind of tender ghost, present in every room though she never draws breath in it. I had known her too, in my capacity as Julian's oldest friend, and I can attest that she had been precisely the sort of woman whose memory could survive being loved past. Warm, unpretentious despite her title, quick to laugh, entirely without the vanity that so often infects those born or married into great houses. She had, I remembered now with a fondness sharpened by all I was learning, spoken of Margaret exactly once in my hearing, years before her illness, calling her the truest friend I have, and the only one who never once asked me for anything since I became a duchess. I mention this because I think it matters, in a story of this kind, that the dead woman herself would have recognized, and perhaps even blessed what grew between her widower and her oldest friend. There was nothing furtive or disloyal in it, though Julian wrestled in his private hours with guilt enough for 3 men, wondering whether his heart's slow thaw was a betrayal of the vows he had made and meant with his whole soul. He came to me one night in November, the fires banked low, and asked me outright whether I thought him dishonorable. "For what?" I said, though I knew perfectly well. "For feeling what I feel. For finding that a woman's hands mending old lace have done more to draw me back to the living than 5 years of my mother's introductions, and my sister's gentle scolding, and my own resolve to endure alone as penance for having failed to save Aline from an illness no physician in England could have cured." I told him what I believed then and believe now, that grief and love are not rivals contesting the same small plot of ground in a man's heart, but neighbors, and that a heart large enough to grieve as deeply as his had grieved was also, by the same measure, large enough to love again without diminishing what came before. "Aline would not have wanted you cloistered in mourning until you followed her into the ground," I said, perhaps too bluntly, but he did not flinch from it. "And if any woman living could understand what it costs you to admit this, it is the very woman who spent 4 years honoring her memory without asking for a farthing or a word of thanks. If Margaret Vane begrudged you a new happiness, Julian, she would never have mended that gown so carefully in the first place. Some part of her tended it for the day you might finally open that door again, whether she knew it or not." He did not answer, but I saw something in his face loosen, the way a fist unclenches after long strain, and I knew before he did that he had already decided, in some deep unspoken chamber of himself, that he would not let this second chance pass him by out of fidelity to a grief that no longer required his suffering to prove itself real. The turning came, as these things often do, on an ordinary afternoon that circumstance transformed into something neither of them forgot. It was late in that same November, the gardens gone brown and skeletal, when Margaret came to Witchwood at Mrs. Purnell's invitation. No longer a secret visit, but an acknowledged one, for by then the household had quietly absorbed the truth of her long service and regarded her, if anything, with a kind of warm respect that Julian himself now shared without reservation. She had come to see to the letters this time, the packet of correspondence between Alina and her sister that had begun, after years in a damp corner despite Margaret's care, to show the faint foxing of age along their folds. Julian found her in the memorial room again, as he so often did now by design rather than accident, and watched her a moment from the doorway before she noticed him, her head bent over the fragile paper, her hands as careful with old ink as they had always been with old silk. "I have been thinking," he said when she looked up, "that this room ought not remain shuttered any longer. Alina loved light. She always said this house wanted for more of it." Margaret set down the letters gently. "What are you proposing, Your Grace?" "That we open the curtains, properly. Let the room breathe as a room ought to, rather than stand as a tomb dressed up in dust sheets." He paused, and I think this was the moment, more than any other, where he crossed some threshold within himself. "I do not wish to erase her, Margaret. I wish to stop treating her memory as a wound that must be kept forever raw to prove I loved her truly. You taught me that a memory can be tended with care rather than buried in dread. I should like to learn to do the same if you will help me." It was the first time, I believe, that he had called her simply by her Christian name, and she heard it and did not correct him. "I will help you," she said, "though I think you have already learned more of it than you credit yourself." He crossed the room to stand beside her at the writing desk, and for a moment neither spoke, the two of them looking down at Alina's own hand curling across the old paper. And I imagine, for Julian described it to me with a care I had rarely heard him use for any account, that the silence between them was not awkward but strangely companionable, the silence of two people who have found, in the same tender labor, something they did not expect to share. "May I ask you something?" he said at last. "That has nothing at all to do with gowns or letters or any duty you have ever performed in this house." "You may. Would you walk with me in the garden when the weather allows it?" Not as the Duke calling upon a woman who tends his late wife's memory, only as a man who has found, greatly to his own surprise, that he would rather be in your company than in almost any other. She was quiet long enough that I think, had I been there, I would have held my breath on his behalf. Then she said, with the same unadorned honesty that had first undone him in that dusty room weeks before, "I have wondered, Your Grace, whether you would ever ask me anything for your own sake rather than Alina's. I confess I am glad to hear it." "Is that a yes?" "It is a yes." He told me that he wanted in that instant to take her hand, and did not, because some old formal instinct held him back even as everything else in him strained forward, and instead he only smiled, a real smile, the kind I had not seen cross his face since before Alina's illness first darkened the house, and said that he would call for her Tuesday next if the frost held off, and if it did not, he would come regardless, and they would simply walk beneath umbrellas like a pair of fools. And she had laughed at that, an unguarded sound he carried with him, he said, for days afterward like a coin kept warm in a pocket. Their courtship, once acknowledged, moved with the particular gentleness of two people who had each already suffered enough to know that happiness ought not be rushed, only trusted. They walked the gardens through the last mild days of autumn, and then, when the frost did come, walked anyway, exactly as he had promised, bundled against the cold with Mrs. Purnell's approving eye following them discreetly from an upstairs window. I was present for a good deal of this, since Julian, in the flush of a happiness he had not expected to feel again, seemed to want a witness to it, as though sharing it with his oldest friend made it more solid, more real, less likely to be some fevered dream from which he would wake disappointed. I watched him offer her his arm over uneven ground with a care he had never troubled to extend to the eligible young women his mother once paraded before him. I watched Margaret accept it with the same plain dignity she brought to everything, neither simpering nor withholding, a woman entirely comfortable in her own skin, regardless of whose arm she took. There was, of course, talk in the village, and talk among the county families who considered themselves Julian's proper equals, and not all of it was kind. A seamstress, some said, with the particular sneer reserved for those who fear their own claims to status might be diminished by another's rise. A woman who had, whatever the truth of her motives, spent years in intimate proximity to a duke's private grief, positioning herself, so the ungenerous whispered, for exactly the outcome now unfolding. I heard some of this talk myself, at a dinner I attended without Julian, and I confess I answered it more sharply than perhaps strict manners allowed, because I had watched Margaret Vane closely enough by then to know the accusation for the slander it was. She had asked for nothing in 4 years of unpaid devotion. She had, if anything, resisted Julian's attentions rather than courted them, correcting his invented pretexts, refusing his early gratitude, insisting at every turn that her care for Alina's memory required no reward, and certainly not the reward now being murmured about in drawing rooms she had never once sought to enter. When I told Julian of this talk, thinking he ought to know what currents moved beneath the county's polite surface, he grew still in a way I recognized from years of watching him, the particular stillness that came before he made a decision from which he would not be moved. "Let them talk," he said. "I have spent 5 years permitting other people's expectations to shape my grief, Charles. I nearly let 5 more years pass shaping my life the same way, out of fear of exactly this sort of talk. I will not do it a moment longer. If they cannot see what I see in her, that is their deficiency, not hers." He did more than simply dismiss the gossip privately. At the next assembly he was more or less obligated to attend, a harvest ball held at a neighboring estate, an event he had for years endured rather than enjoyed. He arrived with Margaret Vane on his arm, in a gown of deep blue that Mrs. Purnell had helped her choose, and he did not hide her in some obscure corner of the room but led her directly into the receiving line, introduced her himself to his hostess with unmistakable warmth, and danced with her twice, which anyone acquainted with the customs of such gatherings understood as a declaration far louder than any words. Margaret, for her part, met the room's scrutiny with the same composure she had shown him in the memorial room on the day of their discovery. Chin level, gaze steady, dignity intact. A woman who had spent her whole life among fine fabrics without ever once believing herself less than the ladies who wore them. I watched more than one sharp-tongued matron soften, over the course of that evening, from open skepticism to a grudging, cautious respect, simply because Margaret gave them nothing to seize upon. No simpering, no overreach, no false humility, only the plain, steady grace that had first won Julian's notice in a dusty room he had avoided for 5 long years. It was near Christmas when he proposed, and true to the whole tenor of their courtship, he chose the memorial room to do it, though by then the room bore little resemblance to the shuttered tomb he had discovered that autumn afternoon. The curtains stood open. The dust sheets had been folded away. Fresh flowers, hothouse roses, since nothing bloomed outdoors in December, stood in a vase upon the writing desk, and the wedding gown remained upon its stand in the window's best light, no longer a monument to avoidance, but simply, openly, a cherished remembrance, tended and honored rather than hidden. He told me afterward that he had chosen the room deliberately, not to burden the moment with grief, but because it seemed to him the truest place in the house to ask her, the place where he had first seen, with his own eyes, the quality of heart he was asking her to give him for the rest of his life. "Margaret," he said, and this much he repeated to me nearly word for word, so carefully had he turned the moment over afterward in memory, "I have loved once fully and lost her, and for 5 years I believed that loss had used up whatever capacity I had for loving again. You have taught me otherwise, not through anything grand, but through 4 years of quiet faithfulness that asked nothing for itself, and through months since of a kindness and honesty I have never encountered in any other soul. I do not ask you to replace what I lost. I ask you only to let me love you as you deserve to be loved, plainly and completely, for the rest of whatever years I am given." Margaret, who had faced down a duke's suspicion in that very room without flinching, who had held her composure before a county's whispered scorn without ever raising her voice in her own defense, found in that moment, she confessed to me much later with a rare laugh at her own expense, that she could not immediately speak at all. "I have mended this gown for 4 years, she said finally, when words returned to her, believing I did it only for love of a friend I had lost. I did not let myself imagine in all that time that it might also be leading me toward a love of my own. I would be glad, Julian, more glad than I know how to say, to be your wife." He kissed her then, gently, the room's soft winter light falling over them both, and I like to think that somewhere in whatever endures beyond this world, Alina Hartwell looked upon that moment and was glad of it too, glad that the friend who had guarded her memory so faithfully had found, in the tending of it, a happiness entirely her own. They were married the following spring, in the village church where Margaret and Alina had once sat as girls upon the low stone wall, laughing at some joke long since lost to memory. It was a smaller wedding than Julian's first had been, quieter, without the grand assembly of county families that had attended his marriage to Alina. though a good many of the same families came anyway, curiosity, and by then, genuine goodwill having largely worn away whatever resentment the gossip once carried. Margaret did not wear Aline's gown. I want to say this plainly, because I think it says more about her character than any speech I could construct on her behalf. She was asked once, by a well-meaning aunt of Julian's who perhaps did not think the question through, whether she meant to wear the gown she had so faithfully preserved, as though the mending of it these 4 years had all along been in service of that vain, symmetrical ending. Margaret only smiled and said that the gown belonged to Aline now and always, and that she would no more wear it to her own wedding than she would wear another woman's name. She had a gown made instead, simple and fine, of ivory silk not unlike the one she had spent so many quiet hours restoring, but wholly her own, chosen for herself, and for the man waiting at the end of the aisle, not shaped by any ghost of comparison. I stood beside Julian that day, as I had stood beside him at his first wedding, and I confess the echo of that earlier day moved through me more than once as the ceremony unfolded. Not with sorrow, though sorrow lived somewhere in it still, as it always would, but with a kind of quiet gratitude that a man I loved as a brother had been given, against all reasonable expectation, a second chance at the ordinary miracle of being loved and choosing to love in return. Margaret came up the aisle on Mrs. Purnell's arm, having no living father to give her away, and having asked the housekeeper, with the same plain directness that governed all her choices, whether she would do her the honor. Mrs. Purnell had wept, I am told, the first time anyone in the household had seen her do so in 30 years of unshakable service, and walked Margaret to the altar with her chin held high, as proud as any mother could have been. Julian wept too when Margaret reached him, though he would likely deny it if pressed, and I will not embarrass him further here than I already have by recording it plainly. He took her hands and I heard him say low, meant only for her though I stood near enough to catch it, that he had spent 5 years believing the best of his life already behind him, and that she had shown him, needle and thread and quiet unasked-for devotion, that love does not end when a life ends. It only waits, patient as careful mending, for someone brave enough to take it up again. I visited Witchwood again the following autumn, a full year after the day Julian first pushed open the door of that shuttered room, and found a stranger tending his grief more faithfully than he had managed himself. The memorial room stood transformed by then into something gentler, not erased, never erased, for Julian would not have permitted that and Margaret would not have wanted it, but softened into a room of remembrance rather than avoidance, its curtains always open now, fresh flowers always upon the desk, the gown still standing in its place of honor, still lovingly kept, a piece of the household's history rather than a wound sealed away from the light. Margaret showed me the letters herself that day, the correspondence between Aline and her sister that she had spent so many careful hours preserving, and she read me a passage from one written not long before Aline's illness first showed its earliest signs, in which Aline wrote of Margaret with a warmth that startled me even though I had, by then, come to know precisely how well the sentiment was deserved. Margaret is the truest friend I have ever had, Aline had written, and I sometimes think, when I consider all the ladies who call upon me now that I am a duchess and never once asked after me before, that friendship untouched by rank is the rarest treasure a person can be given. I hope, whatever becomes of me, that she is never without someone who loves her half so well as I do. Margaret's eyes were bright when she finished reading it aloud, though she did not weep, being not a woman given easily to tears even in moments that would have undone most others. I think, she said, folding the letter carefully back into its place, that she would be glad of how this has all unfolded. I hope she would. I know she would, I told her, and I believed it entirely, having known Aline Hartwell's generous heart well enough in life to trust it would extend that same generosity even from beyond it. Julian found us there a few minutes later, come in search of his wife with the particular unhurried contentment of a man whose house, at long last, held no room he feared to enter. He crossed to stand beside Margaret at the desk, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of a year's happy marriage, and looked down at the letter she had just refolded. I owe her more than I can ever repay, he said quietly, meaning Aline, and I understood he meant it in the fullest sense, not merely for the years of marriage they had shared, but for the friend she had left behind her unknowing, whose quiet devotion to a memory had become, by some grace neither of them had sought or expected, the doorway to an entirely new happiness. You owe her nothing more than to be happy, Margaret said, and to keep this room as we have kept it, open and loved, and never again shut away in fear." He kissed her forehead gently, in that gold autumn light so like the light that had first shown him her bent head and her needle a year before. And I stood a moment longer in that doorway, watching them, before I let myself quietly out and left them to the room that had, against every expectation either of them once carried, become not a monument to what was lost, but a testament to what could still, patiently, faithfully, against all the odds a grieving heart imposes upon itself, be found. I have told this story many times since, at dinners and by firesides, to friends who ask how the Hawthorn Duke came to marry a village seamstress after everyone had long since given up hope of his ever marrying again. I tell them of the door he had not meant to open, and the woman he found inside it, mending what he himself had been too afraid to mend. I tell them that some loves do not announce themselves with grand gestures, but arrive quietly over years, in the patient stitching of a needle no one asked to see, until one day the door opens, and the truth stands revealed in the gold afternoon light, and a man discovers that he has been cared for all along by a heart braver and steadier than his own. That I have come to believe is the truest kind of love there is, not the love that announces itself, but the love that simply keeps mending, quietly, faithfully, whether or not anyone is ever there to see it, until the day someone finally is.